Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. We begin in coastal Georgia, where timberland meets two-lane blacktop and hunting leases stretch for miles. On the morning of December 2nd, 2022, deputies moved in on a patch of woods near Riceboro and locked it down. Not because of a gunshot. Because a hunter backed out of the tree line and called 911 after seeing what didn't belong in a forest. By midday, crime scene tape cut across the pines and a grid search was underway. What investigators found was not one scene but multiple recovery points, spread roughly 3 miles apart. From the first hour, they treated this as a dump/recovery site, not proof of where the killing happened. The work started by the book. A perimeter officer logged every entry. Technicians walked lanes, flagged locations, photographed before touching anything, and packaged what could still carry trace value. Even in an outdoor environment, small things matter: fibers that cling, soil that transfers, plant material that rides along. The medical examiner's team coordinated with the state crime lab. Items left the woods with chain of custody forms attached to every bag. No weapon was recovered. No wallet or phone fixed an identity. There was no note, no message, no quick answer. The timeline, at this stage, was a window, late November, not a minute-by-minute account. If you've watched enough cases, you know why detectives resist rushing the narrative. A dump site can mislead. It can plant a theory where a fact should be. So the first decisions were conservative and technical: document, collect, and hold back on any announcement that would contaminate incoming tips. Deputies canvassed the nearest roadways, checked for private cameras on homes and businesses, and asked leaseholders about recent activity. Wildlife cameras were logged if present. Searchers swept water breaks and ditches where a vehicle might pull off. The focus was movement: how a person or a vehicle enters, pauses, and leaves without drawing attention. What the public heard that week was minimal. That restraint wasn't indifference, it was strategy. The lab would need time. Weather and insect activity would help narrow the post-mortem interval. Any soil or plant trace might link back to a residence or a vehicle. And because the site offered no immediate identity, investigators prepared for a longer route to a name: forensic genealogy, the same tool that has connected unidentified victims to families across the country when fingerprints and faces can't. There is a human center to this, even when we speak in forms and evidence bags. Someone was missing. Somewhere, calls would go unanswered, routines would slip out of character, and a circle of friends or family would start to worry. That's where this case would head next, from a silent stretch of pines to a living network of texts, schedules, and people who could help fix who this was and when she disappeared. For weeks, the woods gave us pieces and silence. Identification had to come from elsewhere. Investigators sent biological samples to the lab and prepared for a longer road: comparative DNA, then genetic genealogy if standard checks failed. That's what happened here. The sample profile was uploaded, potential relatives surfaced, and family reference swabs closed the gap. When the call finally went out, the name was clear and official: Mindy Mebane Casotis, 40 years old, living in the Savannah area in late November 2022. Once you have a name, you don't guess, you verify. Detectives built a late November timeline around Mindy's normal routines: work, errands, phone usage, who heard from her, and when those contacts stopped. Bank and app activity were reviewed for irregular charges or travel. Friends and relatives were asked for recent concerns, any mention of holiday plans, and whether she'd talked about moving, meeting someone, or leaving town. The approach stayed tight: establish when she was last verifiably active, then test every gap. The notification to family was handled with care. They were told what the lab confirmed and what it did not. Not the cause of death. Not the exact location of a homicide. Only that their loved one had been identified from remains recovered near Riceboro and that a state investigation was underway. This is where real cases differ from movies. There's no dramatic reveal, just a controlled transfer of facts. Those closest to Mindy helped anchor the timeline with precise items: messages that went unanswered, appointments missed, calls that typically would not be ignored. That narrowed the window to the last days of November. With that window, the team expanded outward. Cell site and device data were requested through legal process. If a personal phone went dark or left familiar paths, those times would be mapped. If a shared device or vehicle telematics existed, that data would be preserved. Investigators also examined contact lists, who had reason to be with Mindy during that holiday week, who relied on her, who expected to see her and didn't. In cases like this, you start with the people inside the smallest circle. You keep it professional and quiet. You document statements and compare them against objective records. Even before any courtroom testimony, certain themes tend to surface: relationship strain, money pressures, claims about health or travel that don't match the paper trail. Here, the task was to log them without bias. If someone said Mindy was traveling, the question was simple: show the booking, the ticket, the location data. If someone referenced a medical event, could a facility, provider, or record confirm it? The job isn't to argue, it's to corroborate or eliminate. While the identification advanced, parallel steps continued at the recovery area. Searchers made second-pass checks for small items possibly missed in the first sweep. That work didn't redefine the location, it remained what it was from day one, a recovery site. The suspected killing location was not announced because it wasn't proven. Viewers often want a single crime scene, but in real investigations, scenes can be separate: where a person lived, where evidence indicates violence, and where remains are found. Keeping those lanes separate protects the case from self-inflicted errors later. As Mindy's name became public, people who cared about her stepped forward. Co-workers confirmed last shifts and routine messages. A friend recalled a plan that never happened. The small statements that don't make headlines still matter: times, places, and habits that can be tested. In a true crime space full of speculation, that discipline is how you respect a victim: you get it right, even if it takes longer. There's a moment in every case when the file stops being unknown remains and becomes a person with a history and commitments. That moment changes how officers speak on camera and how analysts build their charts. The next steps would be more intrusive: subpoenas for retail records, device and vehicle paths, and any evidence at a residence that might align with the late November window. The question moving forward wasn't simply who could want to harm Mindy. It was who can't align their words with the data. Sometimes, the data lines up too neatly. Investigators noticed that. They don't announce it. They test it harder. Retail records don't care about alibis. They show a time, a place, an item, and the account that paid for it. As soon as Mindy Mebane-Casotis was identified, investigators served process on big-box retailers and specialty outdoor stores within driving range of Savannah and Liberty County. They weren't fishing. They were looking for specific, practical purchases that often show up in violent crime files: edged tools, digging implements, heavy-duty containers, and cleaning supplies bought in a tight band of days. The late November window that framed Mindy's disappearance set the clock. Every relevant transaction inside that window, and the days just before it, was pulled. The first wave of returns established a pattern rather than a one-off. Itemized receipts showed blades and knives, a multi-piece game processing set marketed to hunters, a shovel, absorbent cloths and wipes, and large plastic storage tubs. None of these products are illegal. Many are common in the region. What changed their meaning was clustering: dates stacked around the period where Mindy stopped communicating, and around the period forensic work would later fix as the likely time of death. Each receipt carried a timestamp, a store number, and, when available, the last 4 digits of a card and the register lane. Where loyalty numbers or email receipts existed, investigators matched them to a known household account. To keep this clean for court, detectives built the chain the same way they would for a controlled buy: request, return, preservation, and verification. They confirmed whether the card belonged to the husband or to a shared account. If cash was used, they looked for the presence of the same person on successive days at the same retailers. Where the stores retained in-house footage for that week, analysts requested the relevant intervals around the register times and exits. The aim wasn't to argue motive. It was to lock sequence, items purchased, person seen possessing those items, items later consistent with tasks proven in the case. Some receipts contained SKUs for nitrile gloves and disinfecting products. Others referenced hunting season gear that, standing alone, meant very little in Georgia. A deer processing kit makes sense in November for anyone who hunts. But when that kit sits beside a shovel, a set of knives with different blade profiles, and shipping-style tubs, acquired in quick succession, the context shifts. Prosecutors don't have to prove whether an item was used, they have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. A clustered procurement timeline, tied to a household member and aligned to phone and vehicle movement, becomes one leg of that proof. Investigators didn't treat paper as enough. They mapped the purchasing intervals against device data to see if the same handset traveled to and from the stores. When a morning receipt placed the buyer at a home improvement retailer, they checked whether the associated phone left a residence, hit a cell sector near the retailer within minutes of the transaction, and returned on a route that made sense. If a late-night receipt suggested planning after dark, they watched for the same handset or vehicle telematics leaving again within hours. The data did more than confirm presence, it hardened the idea that these weren't casual, last-minute holiday buys. They were a sequence. Defense teams will often say, owning a shovel isn't a crime. True. The state's job is to show how ordinary objects were acquired in an extraordinary way. That's why the team also tightened the before and after. Before, were similar items purchased earlier in the year? If not, why now? After, did the buyer return any items, exchange them, or add more supplies that suggest cleanup or transport? Returns can be as telling as purchases. People rethink needs once a plan moves to execution. In this file, the cadence mattered. It appeared tight. It appeared deliberate. And it aligned too cleanly with the silent space in Mindy's timeline. When data lines up that cleanly, you pressure test it again. One more angle. Cash. If a purchase came through without a card trail, detectives looked for supporting dots, parking lot entries, a device geofence inside the store, or even a second receipt from the same day that did use a card, tying the person to that location in the same hour. Investigators dislike gaps. They fill them with overlapping proofs so a jury sees the same story told by different systems. You don't need drama to make it persuasive, you need consistency. Behind all of this is the human point. The reason we measure receipts at all is because a woman's last week vanished from view. We owe accuracy to her name, not theatrics. This isn't about painting a shopper as a villain because they walked through an outdoor retailer during hunting season. It's about asking whether a set of purchases, stacked tight against a disappearance and a body recovery, stays innocent when the rest of the record is added. The next step does exactly that, laying the retail pattern beside the residence checks to see whether indications inside the home align with what was bought outside of it. The receipts gave us a sequence. The next question was whether anything inside the home matched that sequence. Detectives served a warrant on the Savannah residence and went in with a standard plan, wide photographs, then close-ups, then screening in places where activity is most likely to leave a trace, living area, bathroom, laundry, and anything used for rest or storage. We treated the apartment as a forensic testing location, not as the homicide scene. That distinction matters. Riceboro remained the recovery site. The apartment was where we looked for indications that lined up with late November. The living room held a futon that drew attention. Fabric furniture absorbs more than a hardwood chair, and it's easily moved. The team documented it from all angles before any testing. A chemiluminescent screen suggested possible blood indications on and around the futon surface. That's a screening tool, not a verdict. Swabs were taken and preserved, and the room was mapped so we could tell a jury exactly which cushions, seams, and floor edges were sampled. Nearby, cleaning products consistent with what we saw on receipts were photographed in place and then logged. Nothing about those products is illegal. It's the timing and the co-location with other findings that start to tell a story. Kitchen and bath got the same treatment. Drains were screened, traps checked, and visible surfaces photographed before swabbing. Where the eye saw nothing, luminance screening sometimes offered a lead. Again, leads aren't proof. We documented reactions, we pulled controls, and we sent the collected swabs to the lab with full chain of custody. The goal wasn't spectacle, it was alignment. Do we see, in this home, indications consistent with the tools and supplies acquired during the window when Mindy's communication stopped? Bedrooms and closets were handled carefully. Investigators looked for recent laundering that didn't fit normal patterns, multiple heavy-duty trash bags in a bedroom, a detergent bottle nearly emptied in a short span, or a washer run that was stopped mid-cycle. If a rug had been moved, we photographed the outline on the floor. If a mattress cover was new, we checked the purchase date against the timeline. These are small points on their own. Together, they can support or collapse an explanation. That's the difference between speculation and evidence. You gather enough points that the curve becomes clear. Digital devices inside the residence were logged but not rummaged through on the spot. Phones, laptops, and external storage were documented and taken under separate authority so examiners could pull usage times and file changes. If someone wiped a device or installed software to clean up, that shows up as a new event in a log. If a user searched for disposal methods, that can surface with proper legal process. None of that says who by itself. It tells you whether words and actions line up. Two other checks are routine but important. First, odors. Investigators don't make claims based on smell, but they note chemical or solvent odors as a lead to specific areas for swabbing or ventilation paths. Second, transport surfaces. Door thresholds, trunk liners, and vehicle cargo areas connected to the household were screened later, after the home search, to avoid cross-contamination. If a lab later reports a match between material recovered from a trunk and material consistent with residue in the living room, that connection becomes part of the narrative a jury can understand. Defense teams commonly argue that screening reagents can react to substances other than blood. That's true, and that's why we treat a positive screen as a reason to confirm, not as confirmation. In this case, the report language stayed disciplined, indications present on specific surfaces, samples collected, results pending at the time of the initial search. When results returned, they were weighed alongside the receipts and the device routes, not in a vacuum. The public doesn't need a chemistry lesson, they need to know we didn't overstate the meaning of a blue glow on fabric. One detail that mattered to me as a narrator and to the case file, the way the room looked lived in, not staged. A staged room tries too hard, everything new, everything spotless. This space carried normal clutter in some corners and very clean patches in others. That contrast is a tell. If a person cleans only where it's necessary and leaves the rest untouched, the pattern is visible on camera and in notes. It's an honest way to talk to viewers about forensic logic without turning it into jargon. Normal mess here, targeted cleanliness there, and timing that matches a disappearance. We also held the line on what the apartment is and isn't. It is a place where indications were documented. It is not the site where remains were discovered, and at this stage, it was not announced as the definitive homicide location. That caution protects the case and respects the truth we can actually prove. In communities like Savannah and Liberty County, people listen for that precision. It signals that the investigation is being run the right way, not the fast way. When we stepped back from the apartment file, we had 3 rails running side by side, clustered purchases in late November, indications inside the home that could support those purchases, and a recovery radius near Riceboro. Each rail strengthens the others if the timing and the geography continue to match. The next rail is mobility, phones and vehicles, because movement can bridge the gap between a living room and a pine stand miles away. Mobility tells a story people can't spin. After the residential search, investigators pulled device and vehicle records that covered the last week of November 2022. The scope was narrow, a personal phone associated with the household, any secondary handset tied to the same user, and telematics from a primary vehicle. Requests went through proper legal channels, returns came back in waves. The goal wasn't drama. It was sequence, where the devices were, when they moved, and how that movement lined up with the procurement pattern and the Riceboro recovery radius. The first map looked ordinary, routine pings in and around the Savannah address during the day, a drive to common retail zones, returns to the residence. Then the pattern changed. Between late November 28th and the early hours of November 29th, a handset that usually stayed active went silent. No calls, no texts, no app chatter, no routine push traffic that would normally generate a network handshake. For approximately 2 hours, the device presented as powered down or otherwise offline. When it reappeared, it did so near a sector consistent with the corridor leading back toward Savannah, not far from routes that could connect a driver to the hunting lease country near Riceboro. Vehicle data added context. Not every car stores the same things, but modern systems often record door openings, ignition events, and occasional GPS breadcrumbs for service functions. In this file, the recorded events captured a late-night departure window and a return aligned with the handset's back on time. Fuel receipts and store timestamps from earlier that day reinforced the idea that this was a night with planning elements, not a night of routine. The question wasn't whether a person can be out late. The question was whether a late-night run, a 2-hour device blackout, and a path consistent with the recovery area could be explained by anything other than the work of disposal. Too clean is a phrase investigators use when separate streams line up with suspicious precision. You don't accept it at face value, you test it harder. Analysts reviewed tower lists to confirm sector boundaries, pulled additional call detail to rule out network gaps, and checked for the telltale background pings of apps that sometimes slip through even when a user thinks a phone is quiet. The silence held. That matters because most people don't manually shut down a phone in the middle of a weekday night, and because any cleanup theory often requires a period where a device leaves no trail. The travel corridor matters, too. Riceboro isn't a maze. You reach it by committing to specific roads off U.S. routes that cut across timberland and private leases. Those roads don't accidentally put you in a 3-mile cluster of recovery points unless you intend to be there. The handset's last known activity before the blackout placed it inside Savannah sectors familiar to the home address. When it returned to the network, it did so at a point consistent with someone driving back toward the city. That arc is not proof on its own. But placed beside clustered purchases and indications in the residence, it forms a track you can draw with a straight edge. Investigators also checked for companion devices. If a secondary phone was carried, did it remain on while the primary went dark? If a wearable was paired, did its sensors show motion that could place a person in a vehicle? Sometimes, people forget a smartwatch still records steps or heart rate even when a phone is off. Nothing in the file suggested a second device broke the silence. That absence argued intent. The user wanted to leave no signals behind for the period that mattered most. Another pass focused on the morning after. People who stay up late for benign reasons still leave traces, coffee runs, breakfast stops, or a brief return to a store to grab something forgotten. Records showed regular activity resuming, but there was no mundane explanation inserted into the gap that could plausibly account for being near the lease country. When interviewed later, explanations leaned on vague terms that couldn't be confirmed: out driving, needed space, errands. If those things were true, the data should have backed them. It didn't. For viewers who track this kind of casework, it's worth saying plainly, there is no magic in cell site analysis. There's method. You define sectors, you respect the limits of precision, and you never claim more accuracy than the technology allows. In court, analysts explained the range, the overlap, and the confidence levels. What stood out wasn't a single pin on a map. It was a consistent picture across time, an offline period bracketed by movement consistent with the route to and from the area where Mindy's remains were recovered. The last check addressed vehicle interiors. After the device and route work was done, forensic teams screened the trunk liner, cargo areas, and door thresholds. Any residue collected there would be tested against material from the residence and, where appropriate, compared to environmental samples from the recovery zone. Those results are handled cautiously because transfer can occur for reasons unrelated to violence. Still, when cargo areas show unusual cleaning or replaced mats during the same week that a phone goes dark and a vehicle leaves and returns in suspicious windows, the inference strengthens. Circumstantial evidence is not a synonym for weak, it's a network. Here, the network grew tighter. I want to keep the human center in view. Mindy's name anchors every map and log. The reason we measure these gaps, draw these corridors, and match these timestamps is because a woman with a life in Savannah disappeared in the last days of November 2022 and was found, in pieces, days later near Riceboro. The integrity of that truth depends on getting the technology right, not on overselling it. That's how you maintain credibility with the jury and with the community that's watching. With the route work complete, the file had 4 rails: identification, procurement sequence, residential indications, and movement that could carry someone from a home to a recovery radius under cover of night. The next step shifts from movement to motive, but carefully. We'll separate what prosecutors argued from what the defense claimed, and we'll mark each as such. First, we'll lay the financial and relationship context the state presented to the jury as the reason the late November window turned deadly. With movement mapped, the file turned to why. In court, that answer belongs to theories with evidence behind them, not guesswork. We keep the lanes clear: what prosecutors argued, what the defense claimed, and what the record corroborated or could not. State's theory, labeled, prosecutors told jurors the late November window wasn't random. They pointed to marital strain, a looming $1.5 million civil judgment tied to a prior marriage that had not been satisfied, and an outside relationship that complicated the household. They said a claim about pregnancy collapsed under medical reality. They linked those pressures to the receipts, the residential indications, and the 2-hour blackout that carried a device toward the Riceboro recovery area and back. The state's point was simple: taken together, these are consistent with planning, execution, and disposal. Defense claim, labeled, the defense put forward a very different story. They said the couple had been following instructions from a man identifying himself as Jim McIntyre, supposedly connected to federal work. According to this claim, the pair needed to run and use a non-traditional hospital. They said Mindy suffered a sudden medical event and died under circumstances the husband could not control. He was described as afraid of blood, and capable of lethal violence, and acting under stress and confusion rather than intent. That is the claim. It deserves the same procedural test as any other. Corroboration check. Investigators searched for the hospital, the provider, and the federal contact. No medical records surfaced that placed Mindy in treatment in that time frame. No licensed facility matched the description. No credentialed witness appeared to verify a McIntyre connection or any government directive. Phone and email searches did not produce an authentic federal trail. When a narrative depends on professionals and institutions, those professionals and institutions are expected to exist. Here, the confirmations weren't there. Statement consistency: friends, co-workers, and family offered statements about routine, plans, and the days after Mindy disappeared. They provided timestamps and specifics: calls not returned, events she would not have missed, and claims they heard about pregnancy that did not stand up when examined by the state's experts. Funeral professionals reported inconsistencies in communications surrounding arrangements and status updates. None of those witnesses were asked to decide guilt. They were asked to tell what they saw, heard, and recorded. Their accounts became yardsticks against which later explanations were measured. Behavioral frame: investigators cataloged post-event actions, car cleaning, selective communications, and timelines that shifted under questioning. Each action was matched to receipts, device logs, or witness calendars. The standard was not perfection, it was alignment. When someone says they were doing one thing and multiple independent systems say otherwise, the misalignment is evidence in itself. That's not character judgment. It's casework. Scope discipline: we did not oversell the apartment. It remains a forensic testing location with screening indications awaiting confirmatory context. We did not promote Riceboro to anything but a recovery site. We did not ask jurors to infer motive from rumor. The file kept to verifiable categories: financial records, relationship communications, and the absence or presence of documentation for extraordinary claims. In a place like Liberty County and Savannah, clarity matters. People will accept a hard truth when it is presented with the right boundary lines. Human point: kept brief. When a victim's name is attached to competing stories, the fairest thing you can do, for the family and the public, is hold every claim to the same standard of proof. The state put forward pressures and a pattern. The defense put forward a handler and a hospital. One side brought records that could be checked. The other asked for belief without the documents that belief requires. With motives and claims on the table, the next step was expert testimony. Jurors would hear from genealogy and entomology specialists, digital analysts, and evidence custodians who could show how individual pieces became a single timeline. That's where speculation ends and sworn testimony begins. When testimony turned technical, the story stopped being competing narratives and became measurements. The state called its scientists first to lock the calendar the investigation had already sketched. A forensic entomologist explained how insect activity from the Riceboro recovery points narrowed the postmortem interval to late November, approximately November 27th through November 30th, 2022. He walked jurors through species observed, growth stages, and weather data pulled from the area. No drama, just a window that matched the silence in Mindy Mebane-Casodis's communications and the clustered purchases we've already placed in that same week. Genetic genealogy came next. A state analyst described the build of an STR profile from biological samples, the upload protocols, and how potential kin matches led to targeted family reference swabs. Chain of custody documents and lab worksheets were admitted. The conclusion was simple and sworn: the remains recovered near Riceboro were identified as Mindy Mebane-Casodis. That point moved from investigative belief to courtroom fact. Digital analysts followed. One witness covered cell site mapping, how the primary handset registered in sectors around Savannah before an approximate 2-hour offline window overnight on or about November 29th, and how the device re-entered the network on a corridor consistent with a return toward Savannah from the direction of the hunting lease country. The analyst stated the limits of tower precision and showed confidence ranges. He didn't claim GPS pins, he presented consistent sectors and timing, supported by call detail records. A vehicle data custodian outlined ignition and door event logs bracketing the same overnight period. Another custodian introduced retail records, timestamps, SKUs, and payment identifiers for knives, a game processing kit, a shovel, cleaning supplies, and large plastic tubs purchased within that late November window. Where stores retained short-term surveillance, stills tied a known household member to specific registers at the times printed on receipts. None of this told jurors why. It told them when, where, and how often. Crime scene technicians from the Savannah residence testified with careful language. They described a futon screened with a chemiluminescent reagent and the collection of swabs from defined locations. They said indications, not proof, and pointed to the lab for confirmations. They documented drains checked, textiles seized, and cleaning products photographed before collection. The phrasing mattered. The state wasn't selling a ransacked apartment. It was presenting targeted signs that matched the timing and the shopping list. On cross, defense counsel pressed every limit. Could luminol-type screening react to household chemicals? Yes. Were cell sectors broad? Yes. Were hunting kits and shovels legal to own in Georgia in late November? Yes. The experts agreed on the science and its limits. But on redirect, the state put the pieces back where the jury could see them: independent systems, entomology, retail logs, telematics, cell records, and residential indications, pointed to the same 4 days and to movement consistent with a dump/recovery footprint near Riceboro. No single item won the case, the convergence did. The judge ensured the vocabulary stayed exact. Riceboro remained the recovery site in the official record. The apartment remained a forensic testing location with screened indications. Jurors heard why those distinctions protect the truth. In towns across Georgia, people don't need spectacle, they need confidence that a verdict rests on verifiable work. This is the part of a trial that isn't flashy on TV but decides outcomes. When each witness from a different discipline, bugs, genes, phones, cars, cash registers, draws the same line on the calendar, reasonable doubt has fewer places to live. For the family, it means Mindy's case is being argued with care, not shortcuts. For the community, it shows how modern investigations avoid single-point failure by building a network of facts. The finish came without theatrics. On August 14, 2025, the jury filed in, the clerk read each count, and the words were the same every time, guilty, 12 times over. The case the state built never claimed a confession or a recovered weapon. It relied on alignment, a late November 2022 death window confirmed by entomology, genetic genealogy identifying the remains as Mindy Mebane Cassotis, clustered late November purchases of knives, a game processing kit, shovel, tubs, and cleaners, forensic indications inside the Savannah residence, and mobility data showing a roughly 2-hour device blackout bracketing travel consistent with the Riceboro recovery radius. Each piece came from a different system. Together they formed one timeline the jury trusted. The next morning, August 15, 2025, sentencing was brief and final. The court imposed life without the possibility of parole, plus 25 years consecutive. The judge addressed the desecration of Mindy's body as a profound aggravation, harm that extended beyond death to her family and the community. There were no speeches about grand lessons, just a clear record and a punishment the law allowed. Precision mattered to the end. Riceboro remained, in the official language, a recovery site, a place where remains were found, not where the killing was proven to have occurred. The Savannah residence stayed a forensic testing location, a place where indications were documented and weighed against the rest of the file. The court did not retrofit labels to make the story cleaner. It affirmed what the evidence could actually support. For Mindy's loved ones, the verdict didn't restore anything. It did something more modest and essential. It fixed responsibility in public, under oath. That accountability came from ordinary data put to disciplined use, receipts that keep their own time, devices that remember where they were, logs that don't have opinions. The defense narrative, an unverified federal handler, a non-traditional hospital, a sudden medical event, brought no documents, no witnesses, and no records to match the calendar. The jurors didn't have to guess which story to believe, they had a documented one. There's a human duty in telling cases like this plainly. Saying less than the facts insults the truth, saying more than the facts risks the next case. This file stayed in its lanes, science for the window, genealogy for the name, retail and residence for preparation and cleanup, mobility for movement, and sworn testimony to connect them. That is how you respect a victim and the people asked to sit in judgment. If there's a takeaway worth keeping, it's practical and it honors Mindy by staying focused. Strong investigations separate scenes, document every transfer of evidence, and test explanations against records that can be checked. In communities like Savannah and Liberty County, that discipline is not abstract, it's how neighbors know justice isn't a performance. We close with the facts that matter most and will not change. Victim, Mindy Mebane Cassotis. Convicted, Nicholas James Cassotis. Jurisdiction, Georgia, United States. Outcome, guilty on all counts, August 14, 2025, life without parole plus 25 years, August 15, 2025. The law cannot return a life, but it can draw a clear line and keep it. I've learned that justice isn't loud, it's careful. Separate scenes, verify claims, let records outrun rumors, and keep a victim's name at the center. Cases like Mindy's remind me that communities stay safe when we demand evidence, not easy answers. What did this case teach you about how truth is proven? Do converging facts satisfy you, or would you need something more? If this story resonated, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, or tell me why it didn't land for you. Your voice shapes what we cover next.